going to be looking at the Paris World's Fair of 1900 to wrap things up and to sort of see how Art Nouveau really had come to a climax and, as my colleague Paul Greenhalgh argues, died a strange death after the World's Fair of 1900. But I couldn't resist to put in a little bit of German Jugendstil. So we're going to, for the first maybe 20 minutes or so, or maybe a little longer of this lecture, we're going to be looking at Munich and some of the German international Art Nouveau artists, and then we're going to turn to the Paris World's Fair. So I hope that slight alteration of the content of today's lecture is okay with you. All right, so the term Jugendstil, and I won't do the whole sort of in-depth sociocultural context of German Jugendstil. We'll do more looking at what that style looked like. So the term Jugendstil to describe the German and particularly the Munich manifestation of International Nouveau is really linked to this important art and literary journal called Die Jugend, Youth, which was published between 1896 and 1940 by the prominent Munich publisher and supporter of the progressive arts called Georg Hirt. So this journal really specialized in opening its pages, so to speak, to progressive artists, to experimental artists, to experimental poetry, and to the experimental visual arts. So a lot of the early exponents of International Art Nouveau actually cut their teeth, so to speak, on the pages of this journal. So before long, the term used to describe the progressive arts that we now think of as the German manifestation of International Art Nouveau was Jugendstil, style of youth, both to talk about the fact that this was a new generation of artists. They weren't all young in age. So youth not only meant that they were young, youth meant in this context really that they were rearing against the older generation of artists. And by older, I mean the more conservative, established, institutionalized artists. So youth, Jugendstil, style of youth, means both comes out of these this journal, Jugend, in which the artists and poets and designers publish their new designs and artworks, and it also comes from this rhetoric of the fight of the young against the old, the sort of emergence, the blossoming of a new art. And I think the floral, natural allusions are very clear in these two covers. It's sort of those of you who took my Vienna class remember the tree that was growing out of the bucket, and the bucket was sort of buckling and breaking apart. So it's this germination of something new and exciting happening. Now, the manifestation of International Art Nouveau in Germany was in its initial reception by art historians and by design historians really sort of linked to a particular look, to a particular style. And the argument went in the 1950s and 1960s when this style of the 1890s first came back to the attention of historians. So this style in Germany was very much thought about as being characterized by flat surfaces and by abstracted surfaces. So this print by Peter Behrens called The Kiss from 1898 was often seen as epitomizing that the German manifestation of International Art Nouveau. And it was seen as a style that was deeply rooted in the graphic arts, rather than Modernista, for example, being so rooted in architecture. Now, I think we have to be a little bit careful when we make these kinds of assignations to sort of link the Jugendstil to this idea of the graphic arts and to the flatness and to the strong contours of lines. Because I think when International Art Nouveau was first investigated again after the Second World War, there was a lot at stake to actually find these distinct national characteristics. So the historians sort of reviving International Art Nouveau were trying to pigeonhole French Art Nouveau, Modernista, German Jugendstil into a particular look. So while I do agree that the graphic arts played an incredibly important role in the circulation of this new progressive style during the 1890s and the early years of the 20th century, as I said, particularly through the active culture of journals, I think it is a little bit more problematic to actually make that a distinctly German national trait. Here's another important journal, art journal, that was also very much in support of Jugendstil. And this one was actually published in Berlin by Otto Bierbaum and Julius Meyer-Gräfe, whom some of you might know. He was a really important German art historian at the turn of the last century. And he was also a little bit of a competitor of Siegfried Bing's in Paris, because he opened a gallery called the Maison Moderne, just in the close proximity to Bing's Maison de l'Art Nouveau. So the two of them were friends and colleagues, but they also had a healthy competition going with one another, trying to open up a commercial art market for International Art Nouveau. Now, this is the cradle, the birthplace of German Art Nouveau, Munich, the beautiful town in the south of Germany in Bavaria. This is where Art Nouveau, or I will call it Jugendstil from now onwards while I'm talking. This is really where an important exhibition took place, and I'll talk about that in a moment, in 1897. And it is this exhibition that really put the Jugendstil artists and designers and architects on the map. Now you can see that I've called Munich Isar Athens, Isar Athen in German, and this is a reputation that Munich had really throughout the 19th century, because Munich was seen as the center in Germany for art and culture. And this goes really back to the early 19th century when King Ludwig I, for example, commissioned Leo von Klenze to design this important museum that I'm sure some of you have visited, the Alte Pinakothek. So Ludwig I was really active in making the Wittelsbach, which is the family from which the royals came from in Bavaria, so to make the Wittelsbach collection accessible to wider audiences, and it's really one of the earliest public collections. And this particular building, the Alte Pinakothek, was really designed around this important Rubens, the Last Judgment from 1617, which was in the Wittelsbach collection. Ludwig I's son, Maximilian, wasn't so interested in the visual arts and architecture as his father was, but he was very keen to bring important literary figures, poets and writers to Munich. And he is now remembered for founding the Maximilianeum, which is really an elite institution that educates for public education of promising pupils. And then, of course, we have Ludwig II on the throne between 1864 and 1886, followed by Prince Regent Luitpold, who is really in power for the 1890s, which is the time period we're looking at. The industry in Munich during the time that the Jugendstil artists come to a fore is very much, and I hate to say it because it's such a stereotype, rooted in beer culture. Beer is, to this day, of course, being celebrated as the sort of Bavarian industry, and in the 1890s there were a lot of beer producers in Munich who exported internationally, and I'm just showing you here a postcard of the notorious Hofbräuhaus. Here's another photograph from the late 19th century of the Oktoberfest with the traditional bringing in of the beer barrels onto the grounds of the Oktoberfest. And then here, because I just wanted to give you a sense of there being so many, many breweries, and of course every brewery having its own Stein, its own vessel out of which you drink, and it's a liter traditionally. So the poor women working at the Oktoberfest, they have to actually carry around liter containers. But it wasn't just the beer industry. There was also a really important Munich was at the nexus of a railway system, so wheat that came in from the Ukraine and from Russia was traded and sold on in Munich. So we have this Schrannenhalle, which is the building where that trading took place, which was just off the Viktualienmarkt, for those of you who know Munich. And then we had the printing industry, as well as industry around precision instruments and optical appliances. Now, I always feel slightly uncomfortable when I talk about the importance of this beer culture in the 1890s, because, of course, the beer hall becomes the seedbed for the Nazis, and Hitler, of course, makes Munich the sort of capital, the brown city. So there's these mass events at which Hitler speaks. The first ones are in the beer cellars, and the putsch that actually lands Hitler in prison also takes in a beer cellar. So it is a very difficult history to think about the breweries and their role in the conservative Catholic kind of politics of later years. Munich was proud to be, and from about 1871 onwards, because of course Germany only became a nation in 1871, Munich was proud to be the German Empire's cultural capital. And that's why it's referred to as Isar Athens. And it was really with the coming of the age of the German Empire from 1871 onwards that cultural identity as this hotbed of the arts, as this place where the arts across the genre was really supported, came under threat from Berlin. Because Berlin, of course, was the German Empire's new capital. And so with the emperor, first of all, William I, and then his successor, William II, they were very keen to make Berlin not just the political capital of Germany, but they wanted to tear away from Munich this reputation as being the cultural capital. So between 1871 and 1900, roughly, there's a lot of competition between the two cities, and they're always vying for this title of the cultural capital of the empire. And Munich during this time period really is known as the Künstlerstadt, and a city of artists, versus Berlin being a Kunststadt, a city of art, because it's at Berlin that the academic artists really make their mark. So someone like Anton von Werner, some of you might know his large canvases of important battles. He's very influential in Berlin. So Munich is still holding on to this reputation. And one way of doing this, of maintaining their international reputation as the seedbed of art and culture, is by putting on these important international exhibitions. And they have this fantastic exhibition space, the Glaspalast, which looks very much like Crystal Palace. I mean, it doesn't really look like Crystal Palace, but it's a similar type of building made from cast iron and glass. Similar time period, Crystal Palace, of course, being erected in 1851 for the First World's Fair, and the Glaspalast erected only 3 years later in 1854. And the irony is both these amazing feats of engineering both came to an end through devastating fires, so they both burned to the ground. So Munich really is the center of Central Europe for international exhibitions. And in 1897, this, for us, important exhibition takes place in the Glaspalast. It's the 7th International Art Exhibition, and it's organized both by the Progressive Secession, but in conjunction with the Künstlergenossenschaft, which is a much more conservative, institutionalized organization. So the two band together, really, in this struggle over maintaining Munich's cultural supremacy in the arts. And at this exhibition, it's an art exhibition in the first instance. It's an international art exhibition in the first instance. But the exhibition jury allocated two small, what they called cabinets, two small exhibition spaces to a group of promising up-and-coming Munich architects and designers. And they were Otto Eckmann, Richard Riemerschmid, Hermann Obrist, August Endell, and Bernhard Pankok. And this is what this group of promising artists and designers put together for these two little cabinets. They put together these wonderful total works of art, these Gesamtarrangements. They designed the entire space, including wall decorations, soft furnishings. They produced the furniture. So here, for example, this chest is now at the Stadtmuseum in Munich. So it is really working, and we've got the tableware. So every genre, every medium really that they worked in, they produced for this exhibition to make this interior that is a stylistically unified modern interior. Even the stucco work, have a look here, is very Art Nouveau. So this 1897 exhibition is really when Jugendstil, the German manifestation of international Art Nouveau, is first born, and it is received extremely positively by the international and national press. Here is the second room. I don't think it's quite as successful as the first one I showed you, because there is some historicist elements, I think, still in this massive secretaire or work desk. But I just want to draw your attention to this wonderful tapestry right here. It's called Lake in Moonshine. It's a bit disorienting when you see it, but it's basically a lake here with trees, and the sky is reflected in the lake with this wonderful crescent moon. And this tapestry was actually woven at a really important weaving workshop in Skerbeck, which specialized in these Art Nouveau tapestries. And look at these wonderful borders of frogs that are then sitting in here. So it's really an important exhibition because it puts together these young designers. They articulate a total work of art in a modern style, and they collaborate with one another to come up with this modern design language. As a result, and they are obviously reacting against the kind of historicist overkill that you observe, for example, in Ludwig II's Schloss Neuschwanstein, built between 1872 and 1888. And here are some of the interiors of this space. And here is Ludwig II, and I don't think I need to really say much about him. He's the crazy king. Although I've read recently that maybe he wasn't as crazy as everybody thought he was, but be that as it may. So these kinds of overly decorated, carved, and paneled interiors is something that the Jugendstil artists really react against. Although I think it's really interesting, they are still using dark wood, they're still using paneling, and I think this whole link between, and again, we have to think about that with caution, but the link of the German psyche to the forest, I think, is an important link. And Simon Sharma, the British historian, has written a wonderful book about forests and the importance of forests to all kinds of national identities. But because of Germany's history with the battle at the Teutoburger Forest, etc., the oak tree and the forest is really important. So even these progressive designers can't quite get away from the dark wood and the paneling, although, of course, much stripped back in terms of the decorative scheme that you see in these interiors. Out of this success of the 1897 exhibition comes a effort and an initiative to band together as a group of artists and designers and to open up a workshop. So they want to work together and start a commercial enterprise through which they can furbish Munich and international clients of the upper middle classes with the kinds of interiors that they showed at the Glaspalast and with the kinds of modern style that they felt must take over from the revival of historical styles that had been so predominant up until this point. So they found the Vereinigte Werkstätten für Kunst im Handwerk, which roughly translates into unified workshops for art in handicraft. So they want to, you can already see by this title, they want to bring together the fine arts and craftsmanship. And remember, the first lecture I gave on Monday, I was talking about this concerted effort to erode hierarchies, and that is, this workshop really is an effort to make a success of that. And you can see in this advertisement, which is from 1913, so it's slightly later, but you can see that they have what we call in German dependences, outposts or branches, maybe is the right word, all across Germany. So the headquarters, the main shop and workshop is in Munich, but there are other shops or branches in Bremen, Hamburg, Nuremberg, Berlin, Cologne, and Breslau. So this is really, not only is the 1897 exhibition so important because it puts these young, forward-looking, progressive artists on the international map, but it's also important because it leads to this founding of this workshop initiative that really tries to realize some of the ideas that are advocated in journals such as Die Jugend or Pan. So let's have a quick look at some of the artists that were part of the Vereinigte Werkstätten. We've already seen the whiplash, and I called it Alpine Violet, which is what we call it in German, Alpenveilchen, but this is the proper botanical word, and I will not attempt to pronounce it. Cyclamen? Yeah? And this is this wonderful embroidery that I was talking about briefly on Monday, which was designed by Hermann Obrist, who you see in this fantastic photograph. I just love that. But actually embroidered and produced by Berthe Rouchet, who was an embroiderer who had workshops in Florence and then got together with Obrist, not as a couple, as a business relationship, moved to Munich and opened up an embroidery studio there. So again, just a brief note. We all think about whiplash as being Obrist's intellectual property, which it is. He provided the design, but it's actually Berthe Rouchet who made it. And I think those of you who do embroidery or are into handicraft realize how many creative decisions you actually make when you embroider something. So it's not a passive translation of this great artist genius's idea onto silk and wool. It's actually her role, I think, that must be thought about as well. Just as an aside. Otto Eckmann is another wonderful artist who was part of the Jugendstil group and the Vereinigte Werkstätten. He produced, again, the design for this iconic piece, and those of you who've been to any kind of international Art Nouveau exhibition or who know anything about Jugendstil, it's his Five Swans design, and it's an iconic object in Jugendstil because of, again, the Japanese influence. You remember the prints that I was showing you when we were looking at being a little bit the Japonisme, the flat surfaces, the rhythmic line, the dark contours, the color fields. And so this is, again, woven in Scareback. And he produced a whole inventory of wonderful designs for this weaving workshop, and I'm just showing you one of his designs right here. So this is the kind of this is what he would give to the weavers in Scareback, and then they would translate it into these Klim technique, like Schlitzweberei in German, but it's basically like a Klim tapestry. They would translate this drawing, this design, into this woven tapestry. And I love this portrait. It's actually Lovis Corinth painting Otto Eckmann with the flower in his hand. August Endel is an architect affiliated with the Vereinigte Werkstätten, and he is responsible for this crazy, really, facade of the photo studio Elvira. And look at the date, 1897. So this is a photo studio, a photo atelier that was run by Anita Augsburg and Sophia Gutsticker, a lesbian couple who they were extremely influential both in terms of Munich's artistic circles, but of course also in terms of the suffragette movement and politics in Munich in general. So when they wanted a new facade for their studio, they commissioned Endel, and he did this. This is all stucco work. And unfortunately, the building no longer exists because, of course, I'm repeating myself. The building was located on one of the main arteries that led to Hitler's Haus der Kunst, the neoclassical obscenity that he built for his exhibition of great German art. So he, of course, absolutely hated international Art Nouveau. So in the 1930s, the facade was completely taken down. But we have this wonderful colored-in historical photograph that gives us a sense just of the vibrancy of it. And it's a stylized dragon, the wing right here. And this is the interior. So when you came into the photo studio to have your portrait taken, this is what the foyer looked like. Again, this wonderful stucco work. And you can see how art historians in the 1950s wanted to marry a typically German style to this idea of line, and because of this important stucco work in the photo studio Elvira, for example. And here, Richard Riemerschmidt, one of my, I like his work very much. And he was a real innovator, and he not only designed the famous music room for the Paris Universal Exposition in 1900 for the German contribution to the Paris Universal Exposition. He was a real multi-talented. He was a designer, he was a furniture designer. He designed these amazing Steinkrüge, these stoneware vessels that were produced in a particular area in Westphalia. So they're both modern and forward-looking, but they're also working with very traditional and very German materials and color schemes. And he did this this set of 300 pieces of cutlery right here. That recently was on auction, so I'm sorry I have the Nagel Auktion logo in the corner, but credit given where credit is due. Riemerschmidt is important because, of course, and this is a bit of the sort of after history of Jugendstil proper, in 1907, So one of the quintessential conundrums, is that the word? Thank you. With all of these endeavors, really all of the ones that we looked at, was that, yes, we want to produce a modern style. Yes, we want to make it accessible as much as we can to as many people as we can. But of course, the craftsmanship is so exquisite and the materials are often so expensive that it ended up being, International Art Nouveau ended up being an extremely elitist style. It was for the haute bourgeoisie, the upper middle classes. They were really the ones who could afford the kind of houses that we looked at, and even the kind of decorative art objects that come out of International Art Nouveau. And the Vereinigte Werkstätten, because it was built on this idea and this model of a medieval guild-like workshop, was very aware of this tension between wanting to create a modern style for as many people as possible, but not really reaching as broad an audience as they wanted to reach. So in 1907, and also there were economic incentives to this founding of this new kind of body called the Werkbund. And again, I don't have time to go into it, but in 1907, industrialists from across Germany got together with the craftsmen and the makers and the producers that were affiliated with the Vereinigten Werkstätten, which by this point had really spread. This idea of a unified workshop had spread across Germany. So they got together with industry and they wanted to develop, wanted to marry the two, industry and design. So they started to produce what they called Typenmöbel, Typenmöbel, furniture of type. So basically IKEA in the sort of early 20th century. Furniture that was reasonable, furniture that could be produced by the machine. And again, that's something that distinguishes the German manifestation of International Art Nouveau from many of the other manifestations we've looked at, and especially from William Morris, because the German craftsmen had no problem employing machines in making their objects. So in 1907, this relationship between the machine and the hand, between the craftsman and the worker, really comes to a marriage, so to speak, and this endeavor is created to get cheaper objects on the market so that wider audiences can afford to furnish their homes in a modern style. So ergo, we have Riemerschmidt's workers' living room, for example, being exhibited in approximately 1907. So it's a standard, it's a serial that can be reproduced over and over again. And the German government jumped on the wagon because, of course, they sponsored it, they supported it because they saw this as a niche market that they could really internationally occupy an important role in. And I just wanted to finish off by the important exhibition of the Werkbund in 1914, because it also sums up so beautifully some of the things that we were talking about. So the Werkbund organized a big exhibition in 1914. Unfortunately, it didn't stay open very long because, of course, we have the start of the First World War. And at the Werkbund exhibition, we have a huge falling out between the two camps, between the creative artist designer who has the ideas and the machine and the maker who is more linked to industry. And Hermann Muthesius, who some of you might have heard of before, he really embraced this position that we should employ the machine as much as we can. And Henri van de Velde, who had been working in Berlin for a long time by this point in time, by 1914, was really kind of starting to say, we need to take a seat back, we need to sort of think more carefully about this serial production of furniture, we need to think more carefully about the role of the machine in the crafts practice, because I am a designer, I have these ideas, I'm superior essentially to the machine worker. And so this wonderful poster was produced. Well, it's not a poster, this caricature was produced, and it says, from the Werkbund Ausstellungen, from the Werkbund exhibition. This here says, Van de Velde created the individual chair, Muthesius the type chair, the machine-produced chair, and carpentry master so-and-so created the chair that we can actually sit in. So just a quick look at a couple buildings, because this course was focused on architecture, although the Munich Jugendstil really is much more anchored in decorative arts and in furniture, but there were buildings built, and they were either private villas for individuals in Munich, or they were apartment buildings. So Martin Dülfer, and I'm just going to go through them because I've spent too much time on it already. So Martin Dülfer, for example, designing the Villa Bechtolsheim in 1898. And you can see this wonderful, it's a very conventional kind of villa, but with this wonderful tower and the stucco work again, the sinuous, organic, flowing lines. Here's Henry Helbig's 1900 building. It's a commercial premise at the bottom, and then apartments on top. Very reminiscent, I think, of the Otto Wagner buildings in Vienna on the linke Wien-Zeile that we've seen. Johann Zitter, this building, again, I think, calls back to the Majolica house by Otto Wagner in Vienna, but again, this wonderful decorative work. And then lastly, speaking of flowers and organic decorative schemes, Martin Dülfer's apartment building. Okay, let's go to, the Paris World's Fair of 1900 now. And the reason I want to finish with this, our week with this important international exhibition, is because it is both the apex of international Art Nouveau. So this is when international Art Nouveau really becomes internationally embraced and accepted and celebrated and becomes very fashionable. But at the same time, some historians have argued that this very fashionability of international Art Nouveau was actually it showed its decline. So the strange death, it died after 1900. So here are the grounds of the World's Fair, and of course you can see the Eiffel Tower, which was built for the 1889 World's Fair, and here is the Trocadero right here, and these are the main buildings for the World's Fair. These are the buildings that remain, the remaining landmarks from the 1900 World's Fair. As I just said, the Petit and the Grand Palais, exhibition spaces, of course, today. The Alexandre III, or bridge, the Pont Alexandre III. That still is, of course, an important bridge today. And of course, the whole set of metro stations designed by Guimard. And I love this photograph of the metro underground being built. This is the entrance to the Paris World's Fair, and I wanted to briefly speak about this because of this figure right here, which sat right above the main entrance. It's La Parisienne. So this is supposed to be the sort of embodiment of the modern woman, the new woman. It's not a timeless goddess of beauty. It's not an allegory. It's actually a contemporary woman. And it's the attire that she wore, and I'm showing you this here. So this is the figure that's sitting on top of here, was actually a contemporary, fashionable item. You can see it's a long dress. It's the layered bodice with the gathered waist, with this long coat over it, with the large collar. And then she wears this weird sort of headset that makes her almost look like being at a ship's prow up here, steering us into the future. And when the designers of the World's Fair commissioned the sculpture to make this, they were very adamant that it must be a modern woman. But the critics absolutely hated her. They could not deal with this idea that this wasn't an eternal beauty, the allegorical woman, that this was a contemporary woman, a modern woman who consumed, who was fashionable. That was very problematic for a lot of critics. Now, in 1900, Paris was, of course, considered by many the queen city of expositions. As you know, by 1900, there were 5 of the most important universal expositions that had taken place, starting in 1855 and then going all the way to 1900. And an Austrian visitor to the 1900 World's Fair said, quote, "When Paris undertakes an exposition, it puts itself on the stage." And this wonderful railway map, all railways lead to Paris. I think it just sort of epitomizes both the pride, but also the predominance and the international importance of these exhibitions. And historians have long talked about the 1900 exhibition as really being the final one, the last hooray of this phenomenon of universal expositions or world's fairs, of putting the world on display for visitors to see. And I think there's an important point to that, because that kind of spectacular event really started to have much less impact, although I think they're still going, the World's Fairs or the Universal Expositions. Here's this wonderful view of the Universal Exposition, and I just wanted to point out a couple of things really quickly. You can see it's a large area on the River Seine that was covered. Actually, it covered 108 hectares. And in the 7 months that the exhibition was open, over 50 million international visitors came through the door. So that was a big thing, right? This is the days before television and all of the modern media. So an event like this really drew the crowds. And it's been in the planning for a long time. So here are the main exhibition halls on the Champ de Mars. Again, Trocadero over here, Eiffel Tower here. Here you have where the international, it's the Rue des Nations. So this is where individual countries had their pavilions, because contrary to previous World's Fairs, these exhibition halls were not organized according to country, but they were organized according to what was exhibited. So in order to still show what you had on offer as a nation, the main nations were given this space here where they built their national pavilions. This was a fun thing that, again, we're talking about technology and changes. It's the trottoir roulant, the moving sidewalk. So you can see here, it was a circuit of 4 kilometers that went around. It was 3 platforms, 2 of them moving and 1 stationary. So you can see you just sort of stepped on it and then you were sort of taken. You know, like at the airports when you have the long corridors to walk on. Exactly that idea. And here is again our modern woman, our fashionable consumer that was so problematic at the entrance hall. And this is how it was organized. So rather than having individual nations exhibiting what they're best at, we had these categories. So this is obviously air travel or transportation, from the Zeppelin to the balloon to early airplanes down here. This is a shot of the Rue des Nations, and take a guess which one the German is. Maybe this one here. So this is where you could then put yourself as a nation on the map, so to speak. And across this, literally across the Seine, was Vieux Paris, so old Paris. It was really like Disneyland, a reenactment of medieval Paris that, of course, had been completely destroyed by Haussmann and the boulevards, the Haussmannization in the 1860s. And here is the Trocadero. And I'm showing you this because I'm not sure, the Trocadero, at the bottom of the Trocadero, in this area right here, these white pavilions that you can see the back of, were in the gardens of the Trocadero, was the colonial exposition. So this is all of the colonial powers exhibited there, the native peoples from these colonies. And that's not a new thing, but it was very big in 1900. It was covering a large area. So here is Le Congo Français. So you literally have the dwellings and the people and the material culture being brought from the Congo for the Parisian audiences to see and experience. Here is one of the highlights of the 1900 World's Fair, and that's the that's the electrical pavilion. So this pavilion right here at the end had electric light, and in front of it was the hydro or the water pavilion. So this is this area right here. And the Trocadero I just showed you is right here, and this is the Eiffel Tower, and this is the Rue des Nations, and this is Vieux Paris right here, just to orient you. We're getting to international art now. So here is the Palace of Electricity with the Chateau d'Eau, and then this wonderful celestial globe that was it was a huge model of the Earth on the outside, the celestial constellations, and inside was a diorama, which of course was a very important 19th century invention, where you could engage on a trip around the world. Here again, you see the colonial pavilions right here. Okay, and now we have also international Art Nouveau being exhibited in purpose-built pavilions. The first one I want to briefly talk about is Loie Fuller's pavilion. Loie Fuller's pavilion. She was an American variety artist, really, who'd come to Europe and had conquered Paris by storm with her serpentine dance. And I think some of you will have obviously come across her. She was an iconic sort of figure. There is drawings and paintings of her as well as sculptures. And so she would perform this dance, the serpentine dance, where she had these fabrics that she would put on wooden sticks that extended her arms, and she basically would swing them around. And she had her own pavilion where you could watch her performance, which was also using electric light. So you'd have these colorful lights illuminating these large billowing fabrics. And she, of course, became a muse of the Art Nouveau artists, because she used her body in such a way that created these butterfly-like shapes, these important flowing lines for international Art Nouveau. And we have Siegfried Bing organizing an exhibition. Remember, we've met Siegfried Bing before with his Galerie de l'Art Nouveau. He was the individual who in 1875 traveled to Japan and started a gallery of Japanese art initially, and then opened his Maison de l'Art Nouveau in 1895 to sell French but also international Art Nouveau decorative arts and furniture. So he was given his own pavilion at the 1900 World's Fair, and he in turn then commissioned a series of French designers to put together these model showrooms to show the world what international Art Nouveau looked like in France. The building itself was designed by a young architect called André-Louis Arfitson, and it was entirely financed by Siegfried Bing. There were no state subsidies for this pavilion. Now, Siegfried Bing's pavilion Art Nouveau was extremely well received. International museums directors, for example, Justus Brinkmann from Hamburg, who started the Museum for Kunst und Gewerbe, so for art and applied arts, he had come to Paris, and he bought an entire dining room, Gaillard's dining room we'll look at in a moment, basically off the rack, so to speak. So it was left at the exhibition until the exhibition closed, and then the entire room was moved to the museum in Hamburg. Or the Danish Applied Arts Museum in Copenhagen bought De Feur's entire sitting room. So internationally, this was the place to pay attention to if you were interested in contemporary living, contemporary design. And Bing commissioned 3 artists to basically design these model interiors, these total works of art that we were talking about, these Wagnerian-inspired Gesamtkunstwerke, whereby each piece of furniture, each piece of decorative art harmonized with one another, including the soft furnishing, the carpets, the wallpapers. So the first design I'm showing you was Edouard Colonna's sitting room. And when Bing commissioned these designers who worked with France's leading craftsmen, he really encouraged them to express what he called their individual inspiration and temperament when trying to come up with a stylistic solution to this idea of an organic whole, of a Gesamtkunstwerk. So in Colonna's sitting room, for example, one of the ways in which he is able to create this total work of art is by using the same kind of wood for all of the furniture. So in this instance, he used citrus fruit wood furniture with marquetry inlay. You can see in the corner here, for example, and as well on the table. And he repeats this motif. He uses pastel fabrics, and I'm sorry, it's a black and white photograph, but that's all we have. Pastel colored fabrics for the walls. And you can see here this little settee, this little sitting piece he covered with blue and yellow toned fabrics. And we know the colors because of the descriptions of the critics who visited it and were raving about it. And the rugs also echoed that blue and yellow color scheme, which of course goes so nice with this light colored citrus wood. And the ceiling was illuminated, and you can see this in this photograph, by stained glass window. So you can see how the light, the atmosphere, remember we were talking about that with Horta, how the Gesamtkunstwerk really only comes together in the beholder, in the person, in the room, and how Horta was so good at manipulating light effects through colored glass. So something similar going on here. We have Eugene Gaillard designing the dining room as well as a bedroom. And again, everything is being paid, he pays attention to everything. We've got carpets, we have painted murals on the wall as well as the wallpaper, and we have this amazing bed made out of mahogany with rosewood panels. So these are rosewood panels, and this is the mahogany. And here's the dining room. And the dining room was one of the most praised Gesamtkunstwerke, or total works of art, interiors in Bing's pavilion. And critics raved in particular about the Gaillard chair. And so this chair right here, and we have one of them in a museum. So that's what he looked like. And what the chair looked like, an anonymous critic described it as, quote, "The bottom of the chair is connected by a short, curving piece of wood. This is the triumph of line without which beauty would not exist," unquote. And then we have this delicate Rococo-inspired Georges de Feur women's sitting room and dressing room with these luxurious silk tapestries, gilded screens right here, and this really this boudoir made from Hungarian ash, so a very a feminine kind of space. And Bing was very keen that every stage of the design process was a united effort. A collective will was driving this design effort. And critics celebrated Bing's pavilion as a manifestation, an embodiment of a quintessentially French modern design. And that was important, of course, in the context of an international World's Fair. And this French, intrinsically French style was really rooted in the 18th century, but had the Rococo, which was seen at the time as France's first truly modern style, but it had metamorphosed, it had become a truly modern style because of this employ of organic lines of nature. So this idea of grace and elegance and delicacy was really repeated over and over again in the reception of this particular room here, but of the pavilion as a whole. So critics were really commenting on how Bing had achieved a modern style that was firmly rooted in French tradition, i.e. French Rococo, but did not copy it, took the sort of principal design aspects of it, but made it truly modern. In 1904, Bing sold his gallery and auctioned off his entire Art Nouveau collection, all of the Art Nouveau pieces, and gave up the Oriental side of his business. And I think it's really around this time that the drive and the impetus of international Art Nouveau, at least in France and in Germany. I mean, in Barcelona, it keeps going a little bit longer, of course, as we've seen, comes to a sort of, the energy is kind of gone. It really does become a commercial style. I don't have a problem with it becoming a commercial style, but it doesn't have that energy and that enthusiasm and that belief in it really being a revolutionary things in Paris, because he opened a gallery called the Maison Moderne, just in the close proximity to Bing's Maison de l'Art Nouveau. So the two of them were friends and colleagues, but they also had a healthy competition going with one another, trying to open up a commercial art market for international Art Nouveau. Now, this is the cradle, the birthplace of German Art Nouveau, Munich, the beautiful town in the south of Germany in Bavaria. This is where Art Nouveau, or I will call it Jugendstil from now onwards while I'm talking. This is really where an important exhibition took place, and I'll talk about that in a moment, in 1897. And it is this exhibition that really put the Jugendstil artists and designers and architects on the map. Now you can see that I've called Munich Isar Athens, Isar Athen in German, and this is a reputation that Munich had really throughout the 19th century, because Munich was seen as the center in Germany for art and culture. And this goes really back to the early 19th century when King Ludwig I, for example, commissioned Leo von Klenze to design this important of assignations to sort of link the Jugendstil to this idea of the graphic arts and to the flatness and to the strong contours of lines. Because I think when International Art Nouveau was first investigated again after the Second World War, there was a lot at stake to actually find these distinct national characteristics. So the historians sort of reviving International Art Nouveau were trying to pigeonhole French Art Nouveau, Modernista, German Jugendstil into a particular look. So while I do agree that the graphic arts played an incredibly important role in the circulation of this new progressive style during the 1890s and the early years of the 20th century, as I said, particularly through the active culture of journals, I think it is a little bit more problematic to actually make that a distinctly German national trait. Here's another important journal, art journal, that was also very much in support of Jugendstil. And this one was actually published in Berlin by Otto Bierbaum and Julius Meyer-Gräfe, whom some of you might know. He was a really important German art historian at the turn of the last century. And he was also a little bit of a competitor of Siegfried Bing. So this journal really specialized in opening its pages, so to speak, to progressive artists, to experimental artists, to experimental poetry, and to the experimental visual arts. So a lot of the early exponents of international Art Nouveau actually cut their teeth, so to speak, on the pages of this journal. So before long, the term used to describe the progressive arts that we now think of as the German manifestation of international Art Nouveau was Jugendstil, style of youth, both to talk about the fact that this was a new generation of artists. They weren't all young in age. So youth not only meant that they were young, youth meant in this context really that they were rearing against the older generation of artists. And by older, I mean the more conservative, established, institutionalized artists. So youth, Jugendstil, style of youth, means both comes out of these this journal, Jugend, in which the artists and poets and designers published their new designs and artworks, and it also comes from this rhetoric of the fight of the young against the old, the sort of emergence, the blossoming of a new art. And I think the floral, natural allusions are very clear in these two covers. It's sort of those of you who took my Vienna class remember the tree that was growing out of the bucket, and the bucket was sort of buckling and breaking apart. So it's this germination of something new and exciting happening. Now, the manifestation of international Art Nouveau in Germany was in its initial reception by art historians and by design historians really sort of linked to a particular look, to a particular style. And the argument went in the 1950s and 1960s when this style of the 1890s first came back to the attention of historians. So this style in Germany was very much thought about as being characterized by flat surfaces and by abstracted surfaces. So this print by Peter Behrens called The Kiss from 1898 was often seen as epitomizing that the German manifestation of international Art Nouveau. And it was seen as a style that was deeply rooted in the graphic arts, rather than Modernista, for example, being so rooted in architecture. Now, I think we have to be a little bit careful when we make these kinds of going to be looking at the Paris World's Fair of 1900 to wrap things up and to sort of see how Art Nouveau really had come to a climax and, as my colleague Paul Greenhalgh argues, died a strange death after the World's Fair of 1900. But I couldn't resist to put in a little bit of German Jugendstil. So we're going to, for the first maybe 20 minutes or so, or maybe a little longer of this lecture, we're going to be looking at Munich and some of the German international Art Nouveau artists, and then we're going to turn to the Paris World's Fair. So I hope that slight alteration of the content of today's lecture is okay with you. All right, so the term Jugendstil, and I won't do the whole sort of in-depth sociocultural context of German Jugendstil. We'll be just looking, we'll do more looking at what that style looked like. So the term Jugendstil to describe the German and particularly the Munich manifestation of international Nouveau is really linked to this important art and literary journal called Die Jugend, Youth, which was published between 1896 and 1940 by the prominent Munich publisher and supporter of the progressive arts called Georg Hirt.